Good morning. I'm Mary Leslie. I'm president of the Los Angeles Business Council. Thank you all for joining us this morning. This is part of a webinar series we've been doing on housing and homelessness, hosted by our friends at Wells Fargo. Today, we are discussing the impact of COVID-19 on California's housing crisis. We are honored to have an outstanding group of presenters today to share their thoughts on these issues, beginning with Assemblymember David Chiu, chair of the Housing and Community Development Committee, Eileen Fitzgerald, the head of Housing Affordability and Philanthropy at Wells Fargo, and Robin Hughes, president and CEO of Abode Communities, and Phil Ansell, director of LA County Homeless Initiative. This webinar is especially timely as we know that the results from the county's point in time count conducted in January of this year shows LA is experiencing one of the largest increases in homeless residents of any urban area in the nation. This is heightening concerns that ongoing efforts to address the housing crisis are not built to scale, though we've had tremendous results during the crisis of when federal, state, county, and local officials have worked together. This is heightening our concerns and the need to have a plan. The data, which shows a 14% increase in homeless individuals over 2019 figures, is especially troubling when considering the count took place in January before the COVID-19 economic impacts occurred, and after a year when a record number of homeless people were transitioned into housing. The LABC has been working hard with local, state, and federal officials to advocate for policies and programs that will provide not only emergency resources for our homeless population, but also look to provide long-term housing strategies post-COVID-19. Our speakers today will present their ideas and efforts to provide emergency housing for at-risk homeless individuals and update us on the progress of LA County's Project Roomkey initiative and explain how COVID-19 has impacted efforts already underway and placed additional urgency on many of our local and state initiatives. At the end of the presentations, we will have a few minutes for Q&A. I encourage all participants to ask questions. You need to submit them on the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We will try to get as many questions as we can. We want to again thank Wells Fargo for their efforts during this time. They have dedicated hundreds of millions of dollars to address food, shelter, and small business and housing stability, and have suspended residential property foreclosure sales, evictions, and involuntary auto possessions to help do their part in protecting vulnerable residents, and we appreciate it. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Assemblymember David Chiu, who represents the 17th District, which encompasses Eastern San Francisco. During his first year, he served as Assistant Speaker Pro Tem and has served as Chair of the Assembly Housing and Community Development Committee since 2016. Please welcome Assemblymember Chiu.
Morning. Mary, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to say hello and engage with the LABC.
Thank you.
So I was asked to give a little bit of an update of what's happening in the legislature when it comes to the budget, when it comes to homelessness, kind of the housing agenda this year, and then obviously happy to answer any questions. So let me go through the topics of budget, homelessness, production, and what we all understand to be very likely a looming eviction and foreclosure crisis. So this week, the legislature is voting on the budget. Actually, tomorrow we'll be voting on about a dozen budget-related bills that should finalize this year's budget for 2020-21. Some of the highlights I would say is when it came to housing and homelessness, we were able to maintain fairly steady what we've been doing in the last couple of years, which is frankly a pretty remarkable accomplishment for all of the advocates and the coalition, many of whom are from Southern California and LA, in pushing for this. So just a couple of highlights. We're continuing the $500 million a year investment in our affordable housing tax credit. We are also approving this year $331 million from a settlement over mortgage foreclosures to really assist homeowners who are struggling in that regard. There are monies that are going to be going to cities and counties to the tune of about $500 million to cities, $1.3 billion to counties, that is supposed to be COVID related, but it's fairly flexible, which allows cities and counties to spend money on homelessness and related issues. Another $300 million going to HAP programs. And then I will also mention, homelessness was supposed to be on the agenda, and we were able to protect some continued investments in that, particularly with a new program that Mary alluded to called Project Room Key, which is monies that I think many of you know is going to hotels and motels to help stabilize formerly homeless individuals. The budget calls for $600 million that will go to cities and counties to allow folks within the next 6 months to try to purchase motels and hotels for this purpose. So want to mention, so that's sort of the semi-good news, but if you add all these numbers up, I think we all recognize that this is only going to be, wouldn't say a drop in the bucket, but kind of big drops in a really big bucket that is our housing and homelessness crisis. And there are ongoing conversations about what we can do with a $54 billion budget deficit this year, knowing that we're in a recession. What are we going to do longer term to invest in housing and homelessness? And I want to mention a couple of ideas that are floating around. One is one that I have been championing around the mortgage interest deduction for vacation homes. So the mortgage interest deduction is the largest expenditure that we have as a state, billions of dollars a year that we provide in tax benefits to individuals who own homes. Not just individuals who own their primary home, but individuals who own second, typically vacation homes. If we were to end a deduction for individuals who are able to receive it for second vacation homes, we would potentially have about $250 million a year, or if we were to bond this, bonding capacity for several $1 billion to spend on housing and homelessness. So that conversation is ongoing. There's also been ongoing conversations about whether we should consider a millionaire's tax for a variety of different purposes, but particularly for housing and homelessness. So I want to mention that for further discussion, and obviously happy to answer any questions in that regard. Let me jump, I've already alluded to homelessness, but say, when Gavin Newsom gave his State of the State speech earlier this year, it was envisioned that homelessness was going to be at the very top of the agenda. Coronavirus obviously happened. We know that coronavirus on top of homelessness is like gasoline on fire. And so we've spent an awful lot of time trying to think of how to house people during this time period, with Project Room Key that I alluded to before being really the major initiative in this area. But we also know there's an awful lot more that we need to do. Our Assembly recently announced a package of homelessness bills that just came out of the Assembly. We've really been leading that discussion. I want to thank a number of our colleagues in LA who have really kind of stepped up on this. So Luz Rivas, who has a bill to really streamline a lot of state housing homelessness programs. Autumn Burke, who has pioneered this idea of establishing the right to housing for homeless families with kids. Miguel Santiago, who's been pushing the idea of a $2 billion expenditure a year when it comes to homelessness. Jesse Gabriel, who has a bill to really require a bit more accountability on current homelessness programs. And then I'll mention I am carrying a major bill when it comes to accountability and how we ensure that all cities and counties and state agencies are doing what they need to when it comes to homelessness. The bill was inspired in part by the federal district court judge, David Carter, who is overseeing the major homelessness case that LA is grappling with at this time. And the idea is, at this moment, there have been many lawsuits around the state against cities and counties like LA, who everyone wants to be doing more around homelessness. And what the bill essentially envisions is that we hold both the state and local governments accountable for coming up with a plan to reduce homelessness by 90% over the next 7 years. It requires the state working with local jurisdictions to conduct a gaps and needs analysis to understand what, for example, LA is currently doing, but what it should be doing if it actually wants to end homelessness, and requires LA and San Francisco and every major city and county in the state to execute according to this plan year by year. And it would create a position at the state level, an inspector general when it comes to homelessness, who could hold cities and counties accountable for meeting these benchmarks based on the available resources they have. So this bill, which is supported, I also want to thank Supervisor Mark Ridley Thomas from your region, who is one of the major supporters in his role as the co-chair of Governor Newsom's task force on homelessness, in really driving a major conversation about how we all hold ourselves accountable when it comes to homelessness. Let me shift in probably the next 2 minutes, and I'll just talk about the fact that our legislature has not forgotten what we had also hoped was going to be a major part of our homeless and housing agenda, which is how do we actually build an awful lot more housing. The Senate has a production legislative package. The Assembly does as well. And just touching upon a couple of the topics, Laura Friedman from your neck of the woods has several bills to help streamline and simplify the CEQA process. Richard Bloom from LA has bills that would say we should consider, particularly in middle income neighborhoods around the state, how do we think about upzoning in areas, suburban regions and other areas that are doing well, that are not going to be at risk of gentrification. Richard also has a bill to say that in commercial corridors and commercial parts of cities that are zoned so, that we should make it much easier to allow for housing to be built in those areas. My colleague from San Diego, Lorena Gonzalez, has a bill that would strengthen density bonus law in the state. And I have a bill that would provide incentives, not sticks, but carrots to cities that want to consider upzoning single-family neighborhoods. So we have both in the Senate and the Assembly, what I would say is, real production bills, nothing of the scale of SB 50, but I think in their totality, they would help make a significant difference in helping to build more housing. The last topic I want to mention, I'm sorry, I'm just going around the world in 8 minutes here, is to talk about the looming eviction and foreclosure crisis that we're all very concerned about. And let me just lay the picture on this. It is, at this moment, Governor Newsom and the Judiciary Branch have established temporary eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. It is very likely / possible that in the coming weeks and months, those moratoriums may be lifted as the state of emergency abates, assuming that things with coronavirus calm down, which we all know there's a big question mark about that. But if things trend as we want and these eviction moratoriums are lifted, folks who have not been able to pay their rent in recent months would all of a sudden have rent due and could be subject to evictions within literally 3 or 5 days. This is a story many of you have been reading about, not just in California, but around the country, and could happen literally as early as the next couple of weeks to the next couple of months. Did I just?
We just had a temporary cutout in your back.
Okay. I think what I was saying is, if and when the temporary eviction moratorium gets lifted, we are expecting potentially a wave of literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of potential evictions. And then related to that, potential mortgage foreclosures, particularly for struggling property owners who are renting and who are unable to make their mortgage because their tenants aren't able to pay their rents. The Senate has had a number of bills to address the landlord property owner side of the equation, to really think about relief for particularly small property owners and larger property owners that are struggling because rent is not being paid. I have the major bill that would address the tenant side of the equation. It's my hope that we can figure out a way to allow for tenants to have more time to pay their rent, to not use evictions as the immediate response to the situation. From my perspective, I don't think it makes sense if the temporary eviction moratoriums are lifted to all of a sudden see an entire wave of evictions that would, on the one hand, lead to way more homelessness, and on the other hand, mean that landlords would likely never be able to collect on past rent. And so we're trying to work on a number of ideas to both assist property owners in getting some help and relief in that regard, but also tenants to not face immediate evictions. So stay tuned on that. And That's all I got for you right now.
Well, you have stimulated so many thoughts, Assemblymember, in terms of questions we would love to ask you, but we'll wait till after our other presenters have made their presentations. And thank you, because that was very comprehensive in a very short time. I'd now like to introduce Eileen Fitzgerald, Head of Housing Affordability Philanthropy for Wells Fargo. She joined Wells Fargo in 2019 after a 25-year career in community development, nonprofit, and housing industry. Last year, Wells Fargo unveiled its philanthropy strategy, which included $1 billion in commitments through 2025 to address the U.S. housing affordability crisis. The Wells Fargo Foundation is focused on creating positive societal outcomes by working with stakeholders on addressing housing affordability, small business growth, and financial health. And Wells Fargo donated over $455 million to nonprofits in 2019. So please join me in welcoming Eileen.
Thank you so much, everybody. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you this morning. It's a great pleasure to be here on behalf of Wells Fargo. I'm sorry because my notes just popped up, so give me 1 second. I apologize as we try to get to Zoom world. Thank you. We really, I appreciate the Assemblyman's comments and all that you're doing to support housing affordability in LA and California. As we all know, having a safe, healthy, and affordable place to call home is essential to help lay the foundation for wellness, dignity, and economic opportunity. That has been reinforced so much during COVID-19. I love sadly, really appreciated the gasoline on the fire, but the multitude of hardships and risks faced by individuals and families not having a home. I personally try to recognize my privilege every day as I'm able to comfortably work from home, enjoy our front porch, and have room for our family to work and study appropriately. Wells Fargo is committed to a philanthropic strategy that supports housing affordability, small business growth, and financial health in our communities. We know these are critical to improving economic opportunity, especially for low-income communities and people of color. We're also pleased to report the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency assessed Wells Fargo's most recent CRA performance as outstanding in California and nationwide. So at the Wells Fargo Foundation, we focused our funding since March on COVID-19. I'll talk about that in a minute or two, but I thought it would also be helpful to discuss our 4 strategies for the next several years related to housing affordability. So first, we are focused on increasing the supply of affordable homes, both for renters and homeowners. I know how important this is on the ground in California, and we need to continue to stay focused on it even as we respond to COVID. Across the nation, it's going to be a tough few years as state budgets are dramatically impacted by reduced revenues, increased unemployment, health, and other COVID-related costs. We also, as a nation, need to commit to making our zoning and permitting work better to be more inclusive and not be used so often to make our housing affordability and racial equity problems so much worse. Nevertheless, we are optimistic about the potential of ADUs, especially in Greater Los Angeles, to increase supply by providing additional opportunities for renters, and also because ADUs potentially represent a wealth building opportunity for LMI and Black and Brown homeowners. I know that my immigrant blue-collar white parents got their first toehold in homeownership with a very modest family home in Queens, New York, which then helped them build equity to buy a larger single-family home 10 years later to accommodate a bigger family. We need to look for strategies and investments that make that possible, especially for people of color. Our local Wells Fargo team is supporting a local nonprofit collaborative of Genesis LA, LA Moss, and RNLA to utilize ADUs to expand access to rental homes for Section 8 voucher holders and formerly homeless families. Our next strategy is to expand homeownership opportunities with a special focus on reducing the minority homeownership gap. We have some great opportunities with the low interest rate environment, but we also have such constrained supply across the country. And in the wake of COVID, higher unemployment and more financial uncertainty. It's really critical to increase the supply of affordable homes, especially for first-time home buyers, and to continue to invest in alternative technologies and approaches to building quality and healthy homes more quickly and at a lower cost. I know that California, and Southern California in particular, is really a leader in looking at many of those different options. You know, at the same time, we always need to look for opportunities to reduce the equity and down payment barriers facing so many first-time homebuyers. Last year, we brought Neighborhood Lift to LA County. The Lift program is a signature initiative by the Wells Fargo Foundation in collaboration with NeighborWorks America and NHS of Los Angeles County that offered down payment assistance grants plus homebuyer education. Through this effort, more than 400 homeowners have been assisted in LA County by more than $21 million in down payment grants between 2012 and 2019. Our third strategy is to increase housing stability. This is where we've doubled down in COVID, and I'll come back to this in a minute. Then our fourth strategy is to support transformation at the local level that supports housing affordability. We realize that since housing is fundamentally a local issue, it's absolutely critical that policymakers, local government staff, the business and nonprofit communities, and advocates find solutions that expand housing supply and options. We're working with a range of partners to expand and strengthen this local capacity and to lift up solutions that work. So now to COVID-19. And can you go to the next slide now, please? As you know, we are already facing huge challenges before COVID in housing affordability, and now things are much worse. COVID-19 has caused unprecedented unemployment claims. Low-income people and communities of color are disproportionately impacted. The numbers are staggering, from increased deaths from COVID to consistently facing harder times paying rent. Every data point is showing that. I'm sure you're aware of this, but in LA, with the highest number of unsheltered homeless people in the nation, Black people are 8% of the county population and almost 34% of the people experiencing homelessness. This has to change. We're also really concerned about the likely rise of rental evictions and the impact that will have on communities of color, as the Assemblyman noted. Historically, we've seen that people of color are the most disproportionately impacted by an economic downturn. This includes in the wake of the Great Recession from 2007 to 2016, African American and Hispanic households suffering the highest rates of foreclosure, losing the most wealth, according to a study by the Center of American Progress. In COVID, a few weeks ago, Federal Reserve Chairman Powell reported almost 40% of people in households earning less than $40,000 a year who were working in February lost a job in March. 40%. Just think about what that means for so many of those families. Similarly, according to Black Knight, as of May 12th, about 8.8% or 4.7 million homeowners were already enrolled in forbearance programs industry-wide. Obviously, forbearance is a great helpful step to helping people stay housed, as typically payments and forbearance are being put on the back end of the loan. Unfortunately, there's not such a straightforward solution for renters, and we're seeing a patchwork of solutions and non-solutions around the country. We expect eviction and renter payment challenges to get much worse in the next several months, especially if enhanced unemployment goes away as expected, and their significant new rental assistance is not funded by the federal government. Last slide now. Wells Fargo has responded to COVID in many ways. We continue to take steps to support our customers, employees, and communities in the wake of COVID. From March 9th to April 24th, we helped more than 1.7 million consumers, small business, and commercial customers by deferring payments, reversing and waiving fees, and offering maturity date extensions. As part of Wells Fargo's $175 million philanthropic response to COVID, the foundation moved quickly in support of housing stability, small business, and financial health to assist our customers and the most vulnerable people in communities. We've provided so far more than $30 million through over 850 grants for nonprofit housing intermediaries and local nonprofits working to keep people housed in many areas of the country. These funds will help more than 100,000 homeowners and renters facing financial challenges as a result of COVID, so they are able to keep their homes. This includes more than 300 grants in California. So just to wrap up, I come back to our fourth strategy, increasing housing stability. It's critical at any time, but especially during COVID, to help keep people housed. In LA, you know too well the cost of homelessness for an individual, a family, for local and state governments. In COVID-19, homelessness and overcrowding has brought on a whole new risk of life and death, of the opportunity to have an education or not. Supporting housing stability includes many strategies. A few that we are focused on is supporting homeless organizations, especially here in LA. We are working to help renters stay in their homes by building the capacity of housing counseling agencies to serve renters. Many of these agencies have only served homeowners, but they really have great boots and presence on the ground that can make a difference. We're also working with consumer credit counseling agencies to see if there are better ways to do workouts between landlords and tenants. Both of them need to be able to be financially viable. We're also supporting some legal assistance and eviction prevention organizations around the nation, especially in places where renters are most at risk. You know, when it comes to evictions, there are landlords doing their best to help keep their tenants housed, and other landlords not interested in any workouts. Once a tenant is evicted, it can put them on a path to poorer and poorer housing options. If you have not read Matt Desmond's book, Evicted, or listened to it in your audiobook, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's really enlightening for all of us. We know that legal assistance can make a serious difference in evictions. Harvard researchers found that 2/3 of tenants with legal representation are much more likely to avoid an eviction judgment and keep possession of their homes than unrepresented tenants. Other research found that in eviction lawsuits nationwide, an estimated 90% of landlords have legal representation, while only 10% of tenants do. So this is a glaring equity gap. We have also provided assistance to nonprofit affordable housing providers to strengthen their financial stability, help keep people housed. These providers have reduced revenues, increased maintenance expenses, and increased expense in supporting residents. Finally, in addition to supporting direct services on the ground, we believe it's incredibly important to improve systems, lift up best practices, and identify and propose policy and systems changes. So we're supporting a range of policy, research, and technical assistance organizations to make sure that realistic and practical solutions that are tested on the ground are being considered. Again, thank you for your interest in this topic today, and I'll turn it back to Mary.
Thank you, Eileen. That was quite a bit. And thank you for those national statistics and for giving us a perspective from your perspective from the financial institution. Now I'd like to introduce our LABC member and our friend, Robin Hughes. She is President and Chief Executive Officer of Abode Communities, an LA-based nonprofit, architecture, developer, manager, and operator of service-enhanced affordable housing. She has been actively involved in affordable housing and community development for over 30 years, though she looks so young. And in her 23 years as leader of Abode Communities, she has been the leader. Robin has transformed the organization into an affordable housing finance top 50 developer nationwide and the premier provider of environmentally sustainable affordable housing in California. We look forward to her remarks. Robin.
Thank you, and thank you so much for having me today. I also just want to acknowledge and thank Assemblymember Chiu for his leadership up in Sacramento. It is great to have him as a champion of housing and homeless legislation to address those issues statewide. And I also just want to thank my friends and partners at Wells Fargo who continue to be a leader in supporting homelessness and affordable housing, both from the philanthropic side and from the lending and investment side. So thank you. So today I've been asked to talk about how COVID-19 has impacted affordable housing production during this time, as well as the impact it's had on our rental properties. And I'll come to this both from our own experience as an organization, but we're also part of a national organization where I have an opportunity to engage with my colleagues throughout the industry and have a good handle on how they are experiencing this pandemic as well. So I'll start with construction and entitlement. And I do want to step back because Aileen made a really good point about sort of, I do the same thing as I wake up every day and have to work from home remotely. You know, I am, of course, you know, feel I'm blessed to have this opportunity to work here in my home, in my backyard. But I do think about so many people who are impacted by the health side of the pandemic, including the enormous number of deaths that have been experienced, but also the living conditions that people are living in. And while I feel like as an industry in the moment, we're doing okay, we are still way behind in terms of our need to address housing affordability and homelessness in our region. And as both the Assemblymember and Aileen mentioned, it is this pandemic is disproportionately impacting low-income residents, people of color, and it's really those things we have to continue to keep in mind as we think of new policies and programs as we recover from this pandemic. So in terms of construction, I think we were all pleased as an industry when the state, as well as many of the local stay-at-home orders, included construction and affordable housing as essential businesses with essential workers. So that meant, and it really has been our experience, that things are pretty much moving along as they did in January and February. So we have a couple of projects that were under construction when the stay-at-home orders were put in place, and those projects have continued to move along the path. Inspections are being made. The construction sites, in our case, it was a light time in the construction phase, so the construction crews were relatively light. We were able to do weekly job site meetings virtually, so that was really beneficial. So I think overall, as an industry, construction to date of affordable housing and permanent supportive housing continues to move along quite smoothly. I think as we think about projects that will start later this year or next year, we definitely are anticipating changes in how the job sites are managed and how many people are on the job sites and things like that. So I do think we will perhaps experiencing longer construction periods and figure out how to manage those. But overall, things are running well. What we haven't seen yet that we anticipated was change in construction costs. And I think perhaps the projects that we have starting construction this summer had already been sort of in the negotiating phase, and we haven't yet seen the benefit of lower labor costs or materials or any changes in materials. But I think we'll begin to experience those as we start construction on projects later in this year. In terms of entitlement, we have a number of developments that are in the entitlement phase, both here in LA County and LA City, but also up in the Bay Area. And once again, while doing business a little differently, we're finding that planning departments are open for business and really have adapted their services and programs and processes in a way that complies with the stay-at-home orders and physical distancing. So, we're literally dropping off entitlements applications at City Hall, going to virtual public hearings, and things like that. One of the things that we've had to do as an organization is figure out how we do virtual engagement. It's still a really important part of our work, and we want to make sure that we are reaching out to stakeholders in the communities as we are developing affordable housing. So, still working out ways to present to different associations and communities, neighborhood councils, and things like that, by staying with that commitment. I also just want to say key ordinances and state legislation has really been important in the entitlement process. Our local supportive housing ordinance, we're using that on a number of projects, and It has made it, the streamlining of that process has made it much easier during this time. And I also just want to say the utilization of AB 1197 and a shout out to Assemblymember Chiu, AB 2162 have all been tools that have been incredibly helpful for us in the entitlement process for our permanent supportive housing projects. And then lastly on pipeline projects is lease up. So again, we have found that our lease up process, although different, continues to run smoothly. During this time, we have completed the lease up of one permanent supportive housing project in Lancaster, and we are in the midst of a second project in Southwest unincorporated LA County. And our property management company, once again, just simply had to adapt to how to do things with physical distancing and more phone calls and video conferences to get things done. I think one of the benefits in the moment that both of these projects are permanent supportive housing projects, and we're working with coordinated entry system agencies to identify our residents. And so that having those partners on the ground in place who are also essential business functions at this time has been very useful as well. In terms of the non-eviction moratorium, so I'll start by saying prior to the moratoriums being in place as an organization, Abode Communities was very concerned about what the COVID-19 pandemic would mean from an economic standpoint for our residents. Experiencing either loss of jobs, furloughs, or reduction in revenue, we knew that we would have a challenge in revenue collection. And so as the non-eviction moratoriums were put in place, we had already begun to stress test our own portfolio to see how our properties could withstand any loss in revenue collection. So we did, variations, 25%, 50%, 70%. And, obviously it was those projects that were already struggling that we knew would have challenges. And we began working immediately with our public and private lenders on forbearances to address the issue in the event that those properties began to experience reduction in rent. So it has been really interesting that with the range of federal, state, and local aid to individuals, our rent collection in April, May, and June continues to be in the 90% level, but it is declining. So, and this is pretty consistent from what I've heard from my colleagues in the affordable housing industry. So, in April, we hovered around, 96, 97% collection. That declined a little in May to 94. And this month, we're about 90. So we're definitely seeing a decline. But again, we think we've held at this level because our residents have been able to access different type of aid, including, extended and enhanced unemployment, the local, the Los Angeles card, Angelenos card, all of those things have really been important. I also want to say that for us as a nonprofit owner and operator of affordable housing, our resident services program has been really key. So we provide on-site services for our residents in a typical environment, but when stay-at-home orders were initiated, our resident services team went to remote operations, as we all did, but they were virtually on the ground, checking in with our tenants, making sure that they had access to all the resources they needed, including financial resources. And I think it's been a really important tool of helping our residents to stay stable in their home and pay their rent and also meet other essential needs. So, but I think the concern, and you've heard it from previous presenters, is that once these this government aid runs out, and the high level of unemployment that we're seeing, especially among low-income wage earners and people of colors, we are going to see those collection rates drop and see residents begin to accumulate debt. And so we're very concerned about what that means. And it goes beyond the, at least in LA, the emergency period, as you will recall, the eviction, the non-eviction moratorium here extends for 15 months beyond the point in time where the state of emergency expires locally. So we're definitely concerned about the long-term impact of this accumulated debt for our residents, but also what it will mean for our property. So I'm really pleased to hear that Assemblymember Chiu and his colleagues are working on and will continue to work with groups on ways to address both sides of the equations, to address the needs of the tenants as well as the needs of the property owners. So lastly, I want to just talk about the financial markets. We, as an affordable housing developer, was very much concerned about what was happening in the community lending and investment world and how the economic crisis would impact the financial markets and affordable housing system that we utilize. So we conducted a series of interviews with our financial partners about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I got an update in the last couple of days to see where things are. And we found with community lending investments, many of our financial partners, and they include the big banks like Wells Fargo, were continuing to do business as usual. And we're really pleased to hear that not only were they continuing to close on construction loans that they made commitments to, but they were originating new commitments as well. And this is more focused on 2020. We were hearing that the lenders were definitely adjusting their underwriting, becoming a little more conservative around things like where rents are compared to market, operating expenses, longer construction periods, longer lease-up periods, things like that. But overall, lending activity was happening. Where we have experienced already a shift in the market is on the pricing of our low-income housing tax credit projects. And back in April, or March, April, for our low-income housing tax credit projects, we were seeing equity investments of about $95 to $1 per credit. And now in June, that has gone down to like 80, in the high 80s cents per credit. And so, for example, if you have a $10 million tax credit, that's about $1 million loss in equity on any given project. So we've had to figure out ways to fill that gap in this current market. And as what was really challenging for our lenders and investors was to think about what 2021 will look like. So I think we'll have to continue to monitor the market to see how things will fare in 2021. And then lastly, I just want to touch a little bit on our public affordable housing finance system. And as Assemblymember Chiu has already pointed out, we really need to think about recovery and resiliency. I too am very concerned as local government, state government, and even the federal government experience budget deficits as a result of the economic crisis, that we need to continue to figure out how to make sure that affordable housing and homelessness continues to be elevated as a top priority when it comes to not just funding, but all of the land use things that we've seen come out of Sacramento. I do want to point out that the HEROES Act that is, I think, passed the House and is now in the Senate has really critical components for supporting affordable housing. Within that $1.5 trillion, there's about $100 billion to support the production and preservation of affordable housing, including, again, the concept of providing rental relief as a result of the non-eviction moratorium, as well as production dollars. So I think it's really important that our state and local officials continue to advocate in Washington, D.C., that this the HERO Act is actually passed. So with that, those are my comments, and I look forward to questions at the end.
Thank you, Robin. That was terrific. Really good overview. It will stimulate, no doubt, many questions from our participants. Now I'm pleased to introduce Phil Ansell, the Director of LA County Homeless Initiatives. I think many of you know him. He's been with us many times, and he was appointed Director of the county's homeless agency back in 2015, and it provides oversight and hands-on guidance to deploy the infusion of major H funds, which you know are homeless service funds and programs. He spent 19 years working on programs for low-income families and adults at the Department of Public Social Services, where he was the Chief Deputy Director before the launch of the Homeless Initiative. Phil, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I have some slides, if we could bring those up, please. So I'm gonna, in a few minutes, I'm gonna try to cover a number of areas. First, I wanna just tell you a little bit about Project Room Key in Los Angeles County, then zoom out from that to talk about two major plans released on Tuesday. One by our office regarding older adults experiencing homelessness, and then submitted by the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority to the Board of Supervisors, an overall recovery plan for people experiencing homelessness. And then I want to follow that with some comments about current opportunities in the current moment, and then finally, I want to conclude with a word about inflow into homelessness. So starting with Project Room Key, as most of you know, this is the effort by the county in collaboration locally with LAHSA and the City of Los Angeles, and in collaboration with the state and funding from the federal government, to lease hotels and motels for people experiencing homelessness who are particularly vulnerable to hospitalization or death if they contract COVID-19. And this includes both people who are over 65 and people who have a particular category of underlying health condition. So if we go on to the next slide, in Los Angeles County, we currently are leading the statewide effort. We have 35 hotels under contract with 3,601 beds and over 3,700 vulnerable homeless individuals and couples that are safely indoors, where they now have the ability to stay at home, which they did not have when they were either on the street or in a congregate shelter, which placed them at high risk. Next slide, please. So key to the future of Project Room Key is enabling all currently about 3,700 people who are in Project Room Key sites to exit safely to interim or permanent housing. And of course, our preference and our goal is to help as many of these participants as possible go directly from the hotel or motel into a permanent housing situation with a rental subsidy. The original agreements with the hotels and motels were for 3 months, and in almost all cases, the county has a unilateral right to extend those agreements for up to 3 additional months. So we are finalizing the schedule for closing each of the PRK sites, but we anticipate that the sites will close over a multi-month period over the course of this calendar year. So then that's it for the slides. Thank you. This effort with, we could take down the slides. Thank you. This effort around Project Room Key has been an extraordinary mobilization, where we essentially opened 35 new interim housing sites in about a 6-week period. And to put that in context, that's about a 50% increase in the number of interim housing beds across Los Angeles County, accomplished in just in less than 2 months. So it's very encouraging what's happened. If we could take down the slide, please. It's very encouraging what's happened, and it sort of points the way toward an even enhanced level of collaboration compared to what we've built in the prior recent years in Los Angeles County across both government and community partners, and also shows how when some of the normal procedural constraints on moving quickly are suspended, that as a system we have the ability to move very, very quickly. And one of our key challenges will be around how to continue to do so as we move forward. Now, I mentioned that 2 major plans were released just 2 days ago. On Tuesday, our office responded to a motion by the Board of Supervisors regarding people experiencing homelessness who are over 65. And we identified with expert research assistance the estimate that 6,400 people over 65 will experience homelessness in Los Angeles County in the coming fiscal year. 4,800 of whom are estimated to need housing assistance to exit homelessness. So this report to the board identifies that population, the types of housing assistance they are estimated to need, and the associated costs to eliminate homelessness for people over 65 in Los Angeles County during fiscal year 2021. On September 1st, we'll be returning to the board with an analysis of the costs and services that would be needed to eliminate homelessness for people over 65 in Los Angeles County on an ongoing basis. This report addresses only the cohort of people over 65 who will be homeless during the coming fiscal year. And we're very much looking forward to working with our partners in the state to try to access Medi-Cal funding, and with our local partners, particularly LAHSA and the City of Los Angeles, to try to put the funding together to test this sort of audacious effort to see if we can in fact ensure that no one 65 plus is on the streets in Los Angeles County. On the same day, the Los Angeles Homeless Services Authority submitted a comprehensive recovery plan identifying the costs and service pathways to enable 15,000 vulnerable people experiencing homelessness to move into permanent housing beyond the capacity, for the most part, beyond the capacity of our current system. That includes all the current Project Roomkey residents, everyone else who's 65 plus and not in Project Roomkey, plus other people who are particularly vulnerable to hospitalization or death who are under 65 due to their health conditions, and other people who are highly vulnerable. Over the next 2 months or so, we anticipate that that recovery plan will structure local discussion about the next wave of our efforts to combat homelessness. We are submitting an expenditure plan 1 week from today to the Board of Supervisors that will address county administered funding. The City of Los Angeles is in its own process considering how to deploy hundreds of millions of dollars in one-time funding, primarily from the federal government, a major portion of which is dedicated to combating homelessness. So this is, I'll conclude with 2 points. First, this is, we have a major imperative created by the pandemic, and we have a major opportunity. And the opportunity consists of the combination of the infusion of one-time, primarily federal funding into the region, much of which is dedicated to combating homelessness. And then secondly, as I mentioned, the Project Roomkey has increased the level and speed of collaboration and creates a platform that we can build on to take additional speedy collective action going forward. On a less optimistic note, I want to underscore the centrality of inflow. We placed more people than ever before into homelessness in Los Angeles County during calendar year 2019. But the number of homeless people in the county increased by more than 12%. That reflects the fact that every day more people became homeless than exited homelessness. And as previous speakers have mentioned, there is a risk of a true tsunami of evictions, some subset of people who would be evicted would become homeless. So when we couple that eviction threat with the continued economic circumstances due to the pandemic, we definitely face a huge risk of a massive inflow of people into homelessness, which will exacerbate greatly the, as others have said, the crisis, the homeless crisis within the pandemic crisis that we are already facing. Thank you, and if time permits, I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. No, I think that was really helpful, Phil. And I want to go back now because we just have a few minutes. I'm going to take the moderator prerogative and say that we'll do 5 minutes of Q&A, and I want to start with the Assembly member. Assemblymember, can you talk a little bit about two things? One is your local accountability bill, because we're really interested in that bill, where localities will be required to come up with a plan, an adequate plan to address the homelessness. But I have an issue about the timing of that. How long do you give the localities to comply with that, and why?
So the bill has a number of components. The first thing it does is it requires all jurisdictions. And so assuming this passes January 1st, it basically gives next year for communities to do a needs assessment of what resources currently exist to address homelessness, and then what does the need look like, so that we can understand the gap between resources and need. At the same time, we're also asking jurisdictions to basically put a plan together over, say, a 7-year period to do this. And the length of time is something obviously we're in discussion on, but the hope is basically a plan to make a significant dent on homelessness. Then the idea is, after the first year, every year we're going to be asking jurisdictions to give the state updates on how folks are doing to plan. And if there are cities that frankly are just disregarding or not making real efforts, those are the ones that will likely be targeted. One thing I want to also make clear is we don't hold cities accountable for what they do not have resources to do. So if Phil has, X hundreds of millions or billions of dollars to focus things, we want to say we want to hold you accountable for the monies you have. But if you've got $2 billion in LA and you need $10 billion, we're not going to hold you accountable for not getting $10 billion worth of work done to end homelessness. So does that answer?
Yeah,
the
it
top
does.
level?
I think initially there was a 2030 timeline in there that created some questions among our organization about whether or not that was giving people too long a time, and at the cost of not putting the pressure, some balance of pressure on localities to have adequate plans.
So at the moment, it's a 7-year time window to reduce homelessness by 90% of the number of what we have it now. Now, as you can imagine, Mary, it's a balance, because on the one hand, I think many of us on this call would like to say, let's end homelessness in 3 years or 2 years, right? But we also know just how probably unrealistic that is. So we came up with this 7-year number as a balance. But likely as a stretch goal. I mean, the stat I always give around LA is, you guys are miraculously able to house 133 people every day. And as Phil said, the stat that I'm aware of is 150 people are becoming homeless every day. So despite all the work you're doing, you're not able to change the fact that more people are becoming homeless every day. So we are cognizant of that, trying to be respectful of that, but also pushing jurisdictions to do as much as they possibly can.
Okay, that's fair. And of course, we always have the federal wild card. We're not quite sure what's going to happen there. And that could be a big plus or minus depending on what happens, right?
It's wild right now. Hopefully it won't be in a couple of months.
It is, but it's been wildly helpful lately. So we just hope for that continuing, right? Let me ask you a question that's come up a lot. And this is the tension that I thought Robin so well put so well. What is the guarantee for the current delayed rent payments will actually be paid back? And how will the state deal with this issue? Yeah, sorry, this issue comes up a lot. So can you kind of try to balance that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if any of us had a magic ball to figure out what's going to happen to the economy, what's going to happen to unemployment checks, what's going to happen to stimulus, what's going to happen to coronavirus, we would really like to find that ball. We don't have it. What we think is likely going to happen is that there will be more federal stimulus money for the next couple of months for people's unemployment checks, which will hopefully help them pay their rent payments and their mortgages, at least for the next couple of months, so that people don't fall into the black hole. That's the hope. But at some point, those checks are probably going to end. And for a lot of folks, we're hoping that they're going to be able to go back to work, but we just don't know. And so the conversation right now is just how do we patch all those folks who could fall into a rent hole or a mortgage foreclosure hole to stabilize them in their homes and give them a shot at getting back up on their feet so that hopefully they can pay not just ongoing rent and mortgage payments, but back rent and back mortgage payments. But I'd be, to be transparent, we don't know exactly how this is going to play out. So we are preparing for, I would say, probably not the worst case scenario, but the likely worser scenarios, and hoping that that's going to be enough to get us through.
Got it. So that is a very fair answer, because, and as long as you view it as a series of contingencies, I think everybody can totally understand why that would be true. Robin, let me ask you a question, because people kind of lit up when you mentioned that the construction costs could actually be lower. What exactly did you mean by that? And what methods are you seeing adopted, modular, prefab, that could lower the cost of housing?
So I think perhaps a better way of looking at it is that we, 2018, 2019, we just saw such an acceleration in construction costs because there was so much construction going on. Mm-hmm. So depending on how we come out of this economic crisis and what the level of construction that continues to proceed will have an impact on how construction costs will either level out or not accelerate at the level that we anticipated. And that will primarily be in labor, as we see demand may shift as we come out of this economic crisis for a while. So that may be a place. It's hard to predict material because we get it from so many different places. So I think it's one of those things to be determined. We do recognize that our construction sites will be different, and that's going to have an impact on costs as well. But I think my point may have been more about seeing things flatten as opposed to continue to see it accelerate as we had in the past couple of years. Abode Communities, as is a number of other developers, we're definitely looking at prefab modular housing as a way to help reduce construction costs. We're working in partnership with Mercy Housing and LA Family Housing on a grant that we received from the LA Housing Challenge program. And we are hoping to build, I think, 5 or 6 projects using a prefab model, and we will recognize cost savings in both an accelerated pre-development period, including entitlements. And again, it's thanks to legislation and local ordinance that we're able to do that to achieve those goals, but also in the cost of building and then the time it takes to build. So we're hoping to deliver 350 units, probably at a 20% cost reduction.
And by when?
A 24-month period from the start.
Which may be when?
I'm happy to say we actually have 3 sites under control between our 3 organizations. So we're working on it immediately.
Okay, so this year you can get started potentially. Yeah. Okay. So basically, you're saying you gotta see what happens, and if this works, you'll do a lot more of it.
We are already modeling other projects in our pipeline, assuming that they will be prefab. So.
Perfect. Yeah, because we really have high hopes for that. We'd like that unit cost way down, so we could have a lot more of them. No, it's terrific what you guys are doing. I want to know, Phil, the long list that the Assemblyman read of money that the state has really miraculously been able to salvage from a deficit budget situation, which I think we should give them. Thank you, Assemblyman, for this, because I think if you guys didn't dig in on this, this could easily be lost, right? So, Phil, when you look at this money that the Assemblyman's talking about, you know, from the tax credits, from the settlement, from the COVID, and from the HAP program, you know, is this gonna get you through the next 6 months to a year? Because we had Supervisor Ridley with us just a few weeks ago, and he was pretty much forewarning, as others have, that we're going to have shortages in H and HHH, right? So I'm wondering, is this list going to help you out, make up the difference, at least for the next 6 months to a year?
Yeah, so obviously a very important question. Measure H is a sales tax, so it's extremely sensitive to the economy. Today, our office, the Chief Executive Office, released the board letter regarding final changes to the county budget, which will be considered by the Board of Supervisors on Monday. That board letter identifies a Measure H revenue shortfall of $70.9 million, which is just under 20% of the otherwise projected Measure H revenue. So we are coincidentally releasing draft Measure H funding recommendations tomorrow, which will reflect curtailments, but they will also reflect the aggressive use of other funding sources to mitigate the drop in Measure H revenue, which includes both one-time federal funding and previously allocated state funding through the HAP program. I mean, in particular, the state allocated HAP funding in the current fiscal year. We had been planning to use it over 2 fiscal years in Los Angeles County. Instead, we are accelerating that to use it all in 2021, which creates a risk then in 21-22, of course, even if the Measure H revenue rebounds. So, I mean, it's an unusual moment because on the one hand, we have our core revenue Measure H going down by a substantial amount. And on the other hand, we have various one-time funding sources, including from the federal government as well as from the state. So we're looking at all of that together to try to simultaneously sustain the system that has been built up in Los Angeles County so painstakingly, primarily through the use of Measure H, and at the same time respond to the particular demands of the pandemic. So my overall characterization would be, well, I'll say one other point, that the County of Los Angeles, the City of LA, and 5 other cities, Long Beach, Glendale, Pasadena, Pomona, and El Monte, will collectively receive $325 million in federal emergency solutions grant funding, new as part of the CARES Act. We would like to create a pool of $60 million proportionally across the 6 cities in the county, because the county funding is not for those 6 cities, it's for the other 82 cities and then incorporated areas, to help mitigate the reduction in Measure H funding. And we have initiated communication with all 6 of those cities. If we are able to do that, the curtailments associated with the Measure H reductions will be substantially less. And we are looking to, and we will reflect an approach to that in the draft recommendations that we release tomorrow.
Okay. I wish we had another hour just for question and answers, because I think we could talk about this for quite a while. But I think that you all have provided a lot of information and a nice balance to what's happening that is cautiously optimistic, is how I would I would characterize this conversation, right? That everyone is really doing their best as far as I can see, right? And we do have a lot of help we haven't had normally, though of course we have challenges that are much larger than we have ever had. So we have to hope that these two things stay in concert, right? That as the challenges get bigger, the response gets bigger. But it's not because you're not planning appropriately or you're not seeing it coming, Assemblyman. I'm really happy that you're there and the work that you're doing, because it's really an inspiration, I think, from the local perspective. And as Robin said, the legislation you pass has made a big difference, and the legislation you will pass will make a big difference, particularly in things that don't cost money. Expediting, yeah, okay, we're gonna keep our fingers crossed, because we were a little bit unhappy and then happy again about some things that happened. Some of the bills we kind of liked that went away, and we're behind the bills that are still alive and well, hoping that they stay whole and alive and well. But I think overall, with the governor and his commitment and the coordination, Phil, that's been going on between the city and the county, which has made a huge difference, and the state bringing in the trailers, and the federal government, really stepping up. It's made a huge difference. That's not to say we don't have, as Robin and Assemblyman, as you said, this rental situation could be dire. And we had Maxine Waters with us a couple of weeks ago, and that HEROES Act has got to pass in some form on the Senate side, right? Because these other measures with unemployment and PPP aren't going to do it, right? We need other forms of relief, and I think it's fair for owners of property to need to get paid so they can pay the banks, and Wells Fargo will appreciate getting paid, so that's gonna work out. But the whole system has to work, and I think the fact that you're looking at it comprehensively, Assemblyman, is really helpful. So with that, I'll thank you, and we look forward to continuing the conversation, because it's certainly not over, and we want to thank Wells for supporting this effort. We got off early in March with these webinars, and they've been enormously well attended, which tells me that people really care about this issue and need to be informed, because it is a maze of information, and you all have made it really, you really simplified it and made it clear today. So thank you. Thank you very much, and be safe, and we'll continue to support you. Thank you.